What's good, y'all? Today I'm gonna teach you guys how to make your own bucket hat with this step-by-step tutorial. I love making bucket hats because they're a great way to use leftover fabric from previous projects, and I just love the way they look. Bucket hats were actually one of the first things I made when I was learning to sew, but I could never really find my ideal pattern, you know, with like the nice fit and the shorter brim on it. And so I made my own. So this is like my ideal pattern in my eyes, and I've made hundreds of hats with this pattern, like these. But whether you've been sewing for 6 weeks or 6 months, I think you'll be able to follow along with this pattern just fine. The link to the pattern is below. It'll come with the pattern itself that you can just print off at home, which has some extra notes to help throughout, and it'll also come with the chances to win some free things. So go ahead, get that if you want to follow along. And then this video will give you the extra information that you need, as well as the step-by-step tutorial to make this pattern come to life. I'm gonna show you how to make this hat with lining, but you could use another fabric too to make it reversible. I'll talk about that at the end of this video. Also, everyone's head shape is different. So once you've tested out this pattern, I encourage you to edit it and, you know, make it personalized to you so that it's your perfect fit. And I'll give you some tips on that at the end of this video as well. So without further ado, let's get into it.
All you need is the fabric of your choice. I'm using thrifted jeans, featherweight to medium weight interfacing, and the lining of your choice. I'm using satin. Then you'll print out your pattern pieces on 8.5 by 11 inch paper at 100% scale. You'll see some different notes on the front page, and there's a test square to make sure that it printed correctly. Check that. Now you'll cut out your pattern pieces. I'd recommend having some scissors you only use for paper and not cutting it out with fabric scissors. But once you've got your pieces cut, check the size guide to see which lines you need to cut. I'm making a size large, which is already the outer line, so I don't need to cut it anymore.
It's super simple to figure out what size you need. Just take a tape measure and go right around your forehead and measure that out. So I'm 23.5 going around.
What did he say?
Which puts me right between a medium and a large. So if I want a more snug fitting hat, I go with a medium. If I want a little bit of extra space on a specific hat, then I go with a large.
Now you can cut your pattern pieces to size. You only need to cut on the dashed lines that are marked. You don't need to cut any of the other lines. All right, let's get into it. You'll want to iron out all the fabric, then you'll crease it in half to make the fold you'll be cutting on. I'm using thrifted jeans, so I have to go piece by piece, but if you're using a full sheet of fabric, you can just fold it all at once. Then you'll find the edge of your pattern pieces that say cut on fold, and that'll be the edge that you line up on the fold of the fabric. I'd recommend using a pattern weight of some sort, then you can cut your pieces out. You'll want to notch the pieces on the fold. Doesn't matter how big the notch is, as long as it's not deeper than 3/8 of an inch. Then you can open the fabric up and it'll look like a little pizza slice. You'll use this to line things up as you sew. Now on your top pieces, you'll match these two notches together in the middle, and you'll work your way around to find your new center fold. You'll want to notch this on both sides too, so when you open it up, it's evenly divided into 4 segments. Once you've cut all your base pieces, you should have 2 band pieces, 1 top piece, and 4 brim pieces, and they should all be notched on both sides of the fold. You'll fold the lining fabric in half just like before, and you'll use the same pattern pieces you used to cut your base pieces, but you'll only need to cut 2 bands and a top piece. You won't cut any brim pieces since you already cut the brims for the lining out of the base fabric, and you'll want to make sure that you notch these too. Finally, you'll crease the interfacing in half, but you're only going to cut out the 4 brim pieces this time. Now you should have 4 brims from the interfacing and 4 from the main fabric, 2 bands from the main fabric and 2 from the lining, and 1 top from the main fabric and 1 from the lining. You'll still have this crease in the fabric, so you'll want to iron that out quick, and then you'll fuse the 4 pieces of interfacing to the wrong side of all 4 brims. This just helps add some structure so that the brim isn't all floppy.
Now we're ready to get into the sewing, but before we do that, I want to give you a few notes. First, all of the seams will be stitched with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Second, I'm going to be using a 3mm stitch length for all of the seams and a 4mm stitch length for all of the top stitching. And last, since I have an industrial machine, I'm going to be using heavyweight thread for all of the seams and top stitching of the base pieces, and I'm going to be using a lightweight thread for all of the seams of the lining. But if you don't have an industrial machine, no worries, just use lightweight thread for all of it. It's going to be perfectly fine.
We're ready to sew. So you'll start by putting 2 of your brim pieces right sides together, and you'll sew this at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Feel free to use clips or pins, whatever you're comfortable with. You'll sew both sides for both sets of brims and the bands. Then you'll press open all 6 seams you just sewed, and this will help things lay flat and reduce bulk. Now on the top edge of your band, you'll cut little 1/8 inch slits all the way around. This will add some ease in as you sew. Then you'll clip the top in place, right sides together with the band. You'll want to match the notches on the top to the side seams of the band, and then the other 2 notches to the middle notches of the band. You can sew the top on now. Just go slow, rotate the fabric around as you need to, and work it around the curve. Just make sure you're keeping things lined up and nothing's getting pinched, and make sure your seams are staying flat as you sew them. Remember, they're supposed to be pressed open. Now you'll flip the top to the right side out and match up the brim to the band. Right sides together again, and this time you'll match up the side seams of the 2 pieces and the notches in the middle of both pieces. You'll sew that on. Again, go slow and make sure that your seams are staying lined up and that they're pressed open as you sew over them. Now your hat should look something like this, where you pretty much just have this outer shell.
Now we're gonna grab our lining pieces and we're essentially gonna repeat that process from before, but there will be some differences, so pay attention. I'm gonna switch to my lightweight thread now. If you've been using lightweight thread the whole time, you're good to go.
You'll sew the band pieces of the lining together the same as you did before, but this time, instead of pressing the seams open, you're going to press them both towards the back. It doesn't matter which side you consider the back, as long as they're both facing one way like this. I'm gonna baste my tag in place now. This will get sewn into the seam allowance later. Then you'll do the same as before. Cut these little slits on the top of your band piece to add some ease as you sew. Now you'll clip the top and the band pieces right sides together. Again, matching up the notches to the seams and the notches to the notches in the middle. You can sew it on now. Just make sure the seams of the band are facing the right way as you sew. Go slow. Now you'll take your top half of your hat and clip it to your other brim piece you sewed before. Remember, the seams of the brim are supposed to be pressed open, but the seams of the bands are pressed to the side. Still, you'll match these seams up and match the notches in the middle. Go ahead and sew the brim on. Again, just make sure your seams match up and make sure your brim seam is pressed open and band seam is pressed to the same side it was when you sewed the top on. Then I like to iron the top seam down, so just give it a quick press all the way around, making sure the seam allowance is pointed towards the band. Now for the top stitching, starting with the band and brim seam, you'll top stitch 1/4 of an inch from the seam. The seam allowance should be facing up towards the band. You'll do the same on the top seam, again with the seam allowance facing down towards the band. Your 2 shells should look something like this now. The base shell will have the top stitching on both seams, and the lining shell will only have the top stitching on the bottom seam. Now it's time to combine the 2 shells. So you'll clip them right sides together with the side seams matching and the notches in the middle matching. You'll need to be able to turn the hat right side out after you sew it though. So you'll start a little bit before one of the seams and sew all the way around, but you'll stop about 4 inches before you get back to where you started, and this will leave you with enough room to turn the hat. So you'll sew all the way around, stopping 4 inches before you get to where you started. Then you'll want to grade this seam. That means that you'll trim one side of the seam down to about 1/8 of an inch. Just make sure to not get too close to the stitches and make sure not to grade the area that you left open, so that little gap won't be trimmed at all. You'll do that all the way around. This helps reduce bulk and will help the hat curve better. Now you can get the hat turned right side out. Just get everything pulled through and kind of push the 2 pieces together. Now you'll want to roll these seams out and make sure that they're pushed out as far as they can be and that they're even, and just clip it as you go. Once you get to the gap, you'll want to fold both sides in by 3/8 of an inch and clip it. And I like to measure that gap once I've clipped it just to make sure that it's the same as the rest of the brim. You'll do your first row of top stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Go slow. This first row of top stitching will set the curve for the rest of the rows. Once you finish this, that gap that you had will be sealed shut as well. I do the second row of top stitching 1/4 inch from the first row, and every row after that is also 1/4 inch from the row before. This stitching will add more structure to the brim, and it's a good opportunity to add a contrast stitch in. Go slow. This is literally the final step before you're done. If you space everything correctly, your 9th and final row of stitching should fit perfect perfectly between the previous row of stitching and the seam. Go ahead and look through the hat, make sure everything looks good. I like to burn down any loose thread ends, it makes it look nice and clean.
Now your hat is done. It's super clean and super comfortable on the inside with the satin. Bucket hats are perfect for some spring and summer outfits, and there's lots of customizing that you can do. You know, whether you do two tones and change the colors on it, or you can experiment with the color of the top stitching thread. Lots of different things, even adding distressing and so much more. So just have fun with it and get creative. But before you go, I have a couple things that I want to teach you real quick. I mentioned that once you've tested this pattern, I want you to edit it to make it your perfect fit. So I'm going to show you some ways you can do that.
Say you've already made a medium and a large, and you want to make one that's between the two sizes. Each size mark is a 1/4 inch apart, so what you could do is go 1/8 of an inch, which would be in the middle of those two lines, and that doesn't sound like much, but this would add 1/8 of an inch to each half, which would be a 1/4 inch for each side, and then you multiply that by both band pieces and you've added 1/2 of an inch. So now you're between that medium and large. You just have to make sure that you split the difference for the brim piece and for the top piece as well. If you want to make the brim shorter or longer, you can just add or subtract however much you want from the bottom curve of the band. As long as this line stays straight and this point doesn't move, you won't have to adjust anything else on the pattern. You can adjust the height of the band too. It's a bit trickier, but it's completely doable. Say you want to bring this out 1/4 inch. This line here has to match this top line on the brim. So just make sure you're adjusting this point here, left or right as needed, to make sure that that bottom curve of the band stays the same length as it currently is.
If you want to make the hat reversible, it's super simple. It really already is. It's clean on both sides with no exposed seams. I just personally wouldn't wear this satin on the outside. So say I wanted to have a gray denim on the outside and a red denim on the other side. Remember how we made two separate shells? We made this gray shell and then the shell for the lining, and we combined those two. You would do the same thing, except you would follow the steps for the gray shell for both. So you would make your separate gray shell, your separate red shell, and then you would combine them together the exact same way you did before. Super simple. I hope this tutorial was easy to follow. This is my first YouTube video I've made, so please feel free to drop any recommendations or questions below. I'm happy to help, and let me know what else you guys want a pattern for. Also, it would mean the world to me if you guys subscribe and check out my other socials. I'm going to be doing lots of contests and giveaways with these patterns, so you guys definitely don't want to miss out. Now go get to it. Have fun making your bucket hat. Don't be afraid to experiment with it. I love y'all.